I already sold the house this morning, I said, setting the envelope down on the table between them, my voice calm, almost gentle, as if I were discussing the weather instead of dismantling everything they had planned behind my back. Daniel blinked first, confusion flickering across his face before it turned into something sharper, something desperate. That's not possible, he said quickly, too quickly. We have a signed agreement with the realtor, the listing is active. Was, I corrected, sliding the finalized closing documents toward him. You had a listing. I had ownership. Ashley didn't speak at first, but I watched the color drain from her face as her eyes scanned the numbers. The sale price, $40,000 higher than what they had quietly agreed to accept. Her lips parted slightly, like she wanted to say something, but no sound came out. That was the moment she understood. Not just that they had lost the house, but that they had lost control. You forged authorization documents, I continued, still in that same steady tone, the one that made it impossible for them to twist my words into something emotional or unstable. You contacted an agent without my consent. You attempted to sell a property that was never yours to sell. Daniel's hands started to shake. Mom, we were trying to help you, he said, but even he didn't believe it anymore. The excuse sounded hollow, thin, like paper soaked in water. Help me. I let out a soft breath, almost a laugh, but there was no warmth in it. By deciding where I would live? By planning to move me into a facility I never agreed to? By taking the only thing your father and I built together and turning it into your next investment? Ashley finally found her voice, sharp and brittle. You don't understand the market, Margaret. We were making a strategic decision. No. I cut in, not raising my voice, just ending the illusion with a single word. You were making a decision for me. That was your mistake. I tapped the final page of the contract. The funds have already been transferred into an account under my name alone. The buyer has possession. There is nothing left for you to manage, redirect, or interfere with. Silence filled the room, heavy and suffocating. Daniel sank back into his chair, staring at the papers like they might rearrange themselves into a different reality. Ashley's expression hardened, but I could see it now, the crack beneath the surface. Not anger, panic. And one more thing, I added, reaching into my bag and placing a second folder beside the first. I spoke with an attorney this morning. The documents you submitted? The signatures? They've been reviewed. Daniel looked up sharply. Ashley didn't move. Forgery, I said simply. Attempted fraud. I've already filed a formal report. The word report landed like a hammer. Daniel's face went completely pale. You wouldn't. I already did, I replied. Because this isn't just about a house. It's about boundaries you chose to cross. Ashley stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. This is insane, she snapped, but her voice was unsteady now. You're overreacting. I met her eyes, calm and unwavering. No. I'm responding. For a long moment no one spoke. Then Daniel ran a hand through his hair. His voice quieter this time, almost breaking. We were just trying to build something for our future. I nodded slowly. And now you will. Just not with what was mine. I stood, smoothing the front of my coat, feeling lighter than I had in years. Not because I had won something, but because I had finally stopped losing. You thought I was a step behind, I said, picking up my bag. But I was simply waiting. I walked toward the door, pausing only long enough to leave them with the truth they had earned. You didn't just lose the house, I added without turning back. You lost the only person who would have ever given it to you. Then I stepped outside, closing the door behind me, and for the first time since my husband passed, the silence didn't feel empty. Felt like control. Mom, the buyer is coming tomorrow, so just make sure the house is clean, my son said, like it was the most normal sentence in the world, like he was reminding me to take out the trash or water the plants, and for a moment I thought I had misheard him because there was no way those words could possibly belong to my life. Not in this house, not after 34 years of mortgage payments, birthdays in the dining room, and quiet Sunday mornings in the kitchen where the sunlight always hit the counter just right. So I sat down my coffee cup slowly and looked at him across the table and asked the only thing that made sense in that moment. What buyer? The silence that followed was small but sharp, like a crack forming in glass, and Daniel didn't answer right away. which told me more than any explanation ever could, because my son had never been a man of hesitation, not when he was telling the truth, and I felt something shift inside my chest, not panic, not yet, but a cold awareness that something had been happening around me without my knowledge, something that had already moved too far to be called a misunderstanding. And then Ashley stepped into the room, her heels clicking softly against the hardwood floor, her smile already in place before she even spoke. "We didn't want to stress you out, Margaret, it's just a small showing," she said, her voice light, almost cheerful, but her eyes flickered for just a second, and that was enough because I had lived long enough to know that truth doesn't flicker, only lies do, and I kept my face still, kept my voice even, because reacting too quickly would only give them something to work with, something to twist, so I asked again. "A showing for what?" Daniel exhaled, running a hand through his hair like he used to do when he was a teenager caught doing something he shouldn't have, and for a brief, painful second I saw the boy he used to be, the one who used to come to me when something went wrong instead of standing across from me pretending nothing had. "The house, Mom," he said finally, not meeting my eyes. "We listed it last week." And there it was, simple, clean, and completely impossible because no one lists a house they don't own, and no one sells a home that isn't theirs to sell, and yet I could hear the confidence in his voice, not confidence in the truth but confidence in the plan. And that told me everything I needed to know, so I didn't argue, I didn't raise my voice, I didn't ask how or why or who gave them permission, because those answers would come, they always did, but only if you gave people enough space to reveal themselves, so instead I nodded slowly, as if I were processing new information, as if I were the one catching up, and I let my gaze drift past them toward the window, toward the yard where my husband had once planted a maple tree that now stood taller than the roof, and I thought about how long it had taken to grow, how quietly it had done its work year after year without anyone noticing the exact moment it became something strong, and I realized in that same quiet way, that whatever they thought they had set in motion, they had made one critical mistake because they believed I was standing still and they were wrong. I did not sleep that night, not because I was afraid, but because my mind would not let go of the details, the small things that had once felt harmless but now lined up too perfectly to ignore. And as I lay there staring at the ceiling, I began to replay the past year piece by piece, not as memories but as evidence, because that is what they had become, every delayed phone call, every document Daniel insisted on organizing for me, every time Ashley offered to handle something I had always managed on my own. It all settled into place with a clarity that was almost unsettling, like finally seeing the full picture after staring at scattered puzzle pieces for too long. And I realized that this had not started last week, it had not even started last month, it had been building quietly over time while I was still holding on to the belief that family meant trust without question, that my son would never look at me and see an obstacle instead of a person, and that belief had made me slow, not weak, just slow to recognize what was happening in front of me. But by morning something inside me had shifted, something steady and clear, and I moved through the house differently, not as someone waiting for answers, but as someone collecting them. I noticed the file cabinet in the study where Daniel had insisted on keeping important paperwork after my husband passed. I noticed the missing folder that used to hold the original deed. I noticed the new real estate brochures tucked beneath a stack of magazines that I had not placed there, and when I picked one up my fingers did not tremble. They simply turned the page, calm and deliberate, until I found it. My house, photographed from the angle that caught the front porch in the best light, described in neat, confident language as if it were already someone else's property, and I stood there for a long moment reading the listing details, the square footage I knew by heart, the upgrades I had personally overseen, the description that spoke about future potential, without ever mentioning the life that had already been lived inside those walls. And I felt something settle in my chest, not anger, not even disappointment, but certainty, because there is a moment when confusion ends and clarity takes its place, and once that happens there is no going back to not knowing. Later that afternoon Daniel called, his voice casual, almost rehearsed, asking if everything was all right at the house, and I could hear it then, the careful tone, the way he was measuring my response without asking the question directly, and I answered him the same way I always had, calm, steady, giving him nothing more than he expected. "Everything is fine," I said, and there was a brief pause on the other end, the kind that happens when someone realizes their plan is still intact, and he seemed relieved, too relieved, which told me that whatever they had arranged depended on my silence, on my lack of awareness, and that was when I understood the most important part of all. They were not prepared for resistance, they were not prepared for me to move before they did, and that realization did not frighten me. It gave me something far more useful. It gave me time, and time, when used correctly, is the only advantage that matters. The next day I invited them both over for dinner, not because I wanted answers but because I wanted to watch them, to see how comfortably they could sit across from me while pretending everything was normal. And they arrived right on time. Ashley with a bottle of wine she knew I would not open, and Daniel with that same careful expression he had worn the day before, the one that tried too hard to appear relaxed. And I welcomed them in the same way I always had, calm, warm, predictable, because predictability was exactly what they were counting on. The table was set the way it had been for years, same dishes, same quiet order, and for a while the conversation stayed safely on the surface: work updates, traffic, the weather shifting toward fall. But beneath it all there was something else moving, something unspoken that made every pause feel just a second too long. And I noticed the way Ashley glanced at Daniel before speaking, the way he avoided looking at me when certain topics came too close to home, like repairs, property taxes, maintenance, words that once belonged naturally in our conversations but now felt like triggers they were trying to steer around. And I let the silence stretch just enough before I gently asked, "So, how is the market these days?" It was a simple question, neutral, almost casual, but it landed exactly where I intended. Daniel hesitated just for a fraction of a second before answering. "It is competitive right now, a lot of buyers," and Ashley quickly added, "It is actually a great time to sell," her tone light, practiced, as if she had already said those words more than once in another setting. And I nodded slowly, taking a sip of water, giving them space to continue if they wanted to, but they did not, because they were careful. They were controlling the narrative as long as they believed I was still inside it. And that was when I decided to shift just slightly, not enough to alarm them, just enough to test how deep this went. "I saw something interesting online yesterday," I said, setting my glass down, watching their reactions instead of their words. Daniel froze for a moment, barely noticeable. Ashley smiled too quickly. "Oh," she said, and I held her gaze for just a second longer than usual before continuing, "A house that looked very familiar." And the room changed then, not visibly, not dramatically, but in that quiet way where tension settles into every corner. Daniel cleared his throat. "There are a lot of similar homes in this area," he replied, but his voice had lost its ease, and Ashley did not speak at all this time, which told me more than anything she could have said. So I leaned back slightly, letting the moment pass without pushing further, because I did not need confirmation anymore. I already had it. What I needed was for them to believe they were still ahead, that their plan was intact, that I was still just reacting instead of preparing. And by the time dinner ended they seemed almost relieved again, their confidence slowly returning as nothing exploded. No accusations were thrown, no confrontation forced them into the open, and as I walked them to the door Ashley smiled that same polished smile and said, "Everything is going to work out beautifully." And I returned the smile, just as calm, just as steady, because for the first time I knew something they did not, that whatever they thought they had already secured I had already begun to take back. The following morning I did not call Daniel, and I did not wait for another conversation to reveal itself, because by then I understood that anything they chose to tell me would only be a version shaped for their advantage. So instead I drove downtown to a place I had not visited in years, a quiet office with familiar glass doors and a brass nameplate that had not changed since my husband first introduced me to it. And when I stepped inside, the receptionist recognized me immediately, her smile warm in a way that felt almost grounding. "Mrs. Collins, it has been a long time," she said, and I nodded, because time had passed, but not enough to erase what mattered. And within minutes I was seated across from Mr. Howard, the attorney who had handled every major decision my husband and I had ever made. And I placed the printed listing on his desk without explanation, because I did not need to explain what he could already see. And he adjusted his glasses, reading carefully, methodically, the way people do when they understand that details are not just details, they are everything. And when he finally looked up at me his expression had changed, not to shock but to recognition. "You did not authorize this," he said, and it was not a question, and I shook my head once, steady, certain, and for a moment neither of us spoke, because there is a kind of silence that only exists when something serious has already been confirmed. And then he reached for a file cabinet behind him, pulling out documents that felt heavier than paper alone, and he spread them across the desk, the original deed, the ownership records, the signatures that had been placed there years ago, long before any of this had begun, and he tapped the page lightly. "Everything is still in your name," he said, and I felt something settle deeper inside me, not relief but validation, because what I suspected was now fact, and facts do not bend to intention or assumption. And I asked the question that mattered most, Can they sell it? And he did not hesitate. No, he said simply. Not legally, not without your explicit consent. And there it was, clear, direct, undeniable, and I let that answer sit for a moment, letting it replace any remaining doubt, because doubt is what people rely on when they are trying to move around you, and without it their path narrows. And then I asked the second question, the one that would determine everything that followed. Can I sell it? And this time there was the faintest hint of a smile. Yes, he replied. And you can do it on your terms. And I leaned back slightly, considering not just the option but the timing, because timing is what turns a reaction into a strategy, and I realized that what Daniel and Ashley believed was already in motion was in fact something I could redirect entirely, not by confronting them, not by exposing them immediately, but by moving ahead of them in a way they would never expect. And Mr. Howard continued, explaining the process, the protections, the steps required to ensure everything remained fully within my control, and I listened carefully, not because I was uncertain, but because I wanted to understand every angle, every detail, every possible outcome. And by the time I left his office, the listing in my bag no longer felt like a threat, it felt like information, and information when used correctly is power. And as I stepped out into the afternoon light, I realized that whatever they thought they had started, they had already lost the one thing they needed most, which was my silence without awareness, because I was still silent but now I was fully aware, and that changed everything. That same afternoon I did something I had not done in years. I called a real estate agent, not the one listed on the brochure, but someone else entirely, someone with no connection to Daniel or Ashley, someone who would see me not as an obstacle but as the owner. And when she answered, her voice was direct, professional, the kind of voice that did not waste time on assumptions, and I told her exactly what I needed, not the full story, not yet, just enough to move forward. I want to sell my house, I said, and there was a brief pause on the line, not of doubt but of recalibration, because she could hear something in my tone, something steady, and she asked for the address, and when I gave it to her I heard the shift immediately, the recognition, the awareness of value, and she said, "That property could move quickly if it is priced correctly," and I replied, "I am not interested in moving quickly, I am interested in moving correctly." And there was a quiet respect in her next response, the kind that comes when someone understands they are not dealing with a passive seller. And within an hour she was standing in my living room, walking through the space with a measured eye, noting details, asking questions but not once assuming control, and I watched her carefully, not just for competence but for intention, because intention is what separates help from interference. And by the time we sat down at the kitchen table, I knew I had chosen correctly. She laid out the market data, comparable sales, projected ranges, all the numbers Daniel and Ashley had likely reviewed on their own. But this time the conversation was happening where it should have been from the beginning, with me. And when she reached the part about listing strategy, she paused slightly. "There is already an active listing connected to this address," she said carefully, and I nodded once, not surprised, not defensive, just acknowledging the reality. "Yes," I said, "but it is not authorized." And that was all she needed to hear, because professionals understand boundaries when they are stated clearly, and she adjusted her approach without hesitation, explaining the process of removing that listing, the legal clarity required, the steps to ensure that any previous unauthorized actions would not interfere with a legitimate sale. And I listened, not as someone overwhelmed but as someone aligning pieces into place, and then she gave me a number, not a suggestion but a strong, confident valuation, one that sat noticeably higher than what I had seen in the brochure, and I did not react immediately. I simply asked, "And you are certain this will hold?" And she met my gaze without wavering. "If we position it correctly, yes." And that was enough, because certainty does not come from optimism, it comes from preparation, and I nodded. "Then we proceed," I said, and as she gathered her documents, as we scheduled the next steps, I felt something settle into a rhythm, not rushed, not chaotic, but deliberate, controlled, and as the front door closed behind her, I stood for a moment in the quiet house, looking around at the walls that had witnessed everything, and I realized that nothing here was being taken from me, not anymore, because what Daniel and Ashley had tried to move quietly behind my back had now been brought fully into my hands, and from this point forward every decision would be mine, not just in ownership but in timing, in value, in outcome. And for the first time since this began, I was no longer reacting to what they had done, I was deciding what would happen next. Over the next 2 days I did not mention a single word to Daniel or Ashley, not about the listing, not about the agent, not about the fact that everything they thought they controlled had already begun to shift, because silence, when used correctly, is not weakness, it is leverage, and I understood now that any reaction from me would only give them time to adjust, to correct their mistakes, to tighten whatever gaps existed in their plan. So I let them believe everything was still moving forward. Exactly as they intended, and that belief made them careless. Daniel called again that evening, his tone light, asking if the house was ready for the showing. And I answered him the same way I always had, calm, agreeable. Of course, I said, even though I knew that showing would never happen, not the way they expected, and he seemed relieved again, and that relief told me more than anything else. It told me they were operating on a timeline, one that depended on my cooperation, one that assumed I would continue to follow along without question, and that assumption was the foundation of everything they had built, and foundations, when incorrect, collapse quietly but completely. The following morning my agent returned with a photographer, someone who moved through the house with a careful eye, capturing angles, light, details that I had once seen as ordinary but now understood as value, and I walked behind them slowly, not interfering, not directing, just observing the process as it unfolded properly, legally, with my knowledge, my consent, my control. And when they finished we sat down again at the kitchen table, reviewing the images, the strategy, the positioning, and this time there was no uncertainty, no hidden conversation happening without me. Everything was clear, documented, intentional, and when she asked if I was ready to list, I did not hesitate. Yes, I said, because hesitation had already cost me time, and I was no longer willing to give any more of it away. By the afternoon the unauthorized listing had been formally challenged and flagged, the process initiated to remove it from active status, and within hours my own listing went live, priced higher, presented better, positioned correctly, and I knew the moment it appeared that it would not go unnoticed, not by Daniel, not by Ashley, because the market does not keep secrets, and neither do the systems they had tried to use against me. But still I said nothing, because timing matters more than revelation, and I wanted them to see it on their own, to feel that moment of confusion before realization, that shift from control to uncertainty. And as the day settled into evening, I sat quietly in the living room, the same room where they had once stood speaking as if decisions had already been made, and I allowed myself a small steady breath, not of relief but of alignment, because everything was now exactly where it needed to be, the truth was in motion, the process was underway, and for the first time since this began I was no longer inside their plan, they were inside mine. It did not take long for them to notice, because control creates habits, and when those habits are interrupted, people react. Daniel called me just after noon the next day, his voice no longer relaxed, no longer measured, but tight in a way that betrayed more than he intended. "Mom, did you change something with the listing?" he asked, and I could almost picture him standing somewhere with his phone in one hand and confusion in the other. And I let a small pause settle before I answered, not to provoke, but to allow him to hear himself clearly. "I made a decision about my house," I said, calm, direct, without explanation, and there was silence on the other end, longer this time, heavier, because now the ground beneath him was shifting, and he did not yet understand how far. "That is not what we agreed on," he replied finally, and I could hear the word "we" linger in the air, as if it still held authority, and I responded just as evenly, "There was no agreement." And that was the moment everything changed, not because of what I said, but because of what I refused to say. I did not justify, I did not argue, I did not give him a path back into control, and without that, his next words came faster, less controlled. "Ashley and I already had buyers lined up, we handled everything," he said, and I let that statement settle between us, because it revealed exactly what I needed, not just intent but assumption, the belief that handling something without permission somehow made it theirs to manage, and I answered with the same clarity I had carried since I walked into the attorney's office. "You handled something that was never yours," I said, and there was a sharp intake of breath on the other end, not anger yet, but something close, something unstable, and for a brief moment I thought he might push further, might try to reclaim ground with force or insistence, but instead he shifted, his voice lowering, softer, almost careful again. "Mom, we were trying to help you move forward," he said, and I recognized it immediately, not sincerity, but strategy, the attempt to reposition what had already been exposed. And I did not reject it, I simply let it pass, because engaging with it would only pull me back into a conversation that no longer mattered. "I have already moved forward," I replied, and this time there was no pause, no hesitation, just the quiet weight of finality, and when the call ended it did not feel like a conflict, it felt like a line had been drawn, not loudly, not dramatically, but clearly enough that there was no confusion about where I stood. Later that afternoon Ashley sent a message, shorter, sharper, asking for details, asking for clarification, asking questions she believed she still had the right to ask. And I did not respond immediately, not out of avoidance but out of intention, because timing is not just about action, it is also about silence. And when I finally did respond, it was with a single sentence: everything is being handled appropriately, and nothing more, because explanations create openings, and I was no longer interested in giving them any. And as the evening settled in, I sat once again in the quiet of the house, but it felt different now, not because anything around me had changed, but because everything within the situation had. They were no longer operating ahead of me, they were reacting, adjusting, trying to understand a process they no longer controlled. And I realized that what they were feeling now was not just confusion, it was the beginning of exposure, because when a plan unravels, it does not do so all at once, it reveals itself piece by piece, until there is nothing left to hide behind. And this time I was the one deciding how quickly that would happen. By the next morning, the house was no longer just a listing, it had become a point of attention, and I could feel it even before my agent called. The way the phone sat quietly for a moment too long before ringing, the way the air in the house felt different, as if something had shifted beyond these walls and was now moving back toward me. And when I answered, her voice carried that same controlled energy I had come to recognize. "We have interest," she said, not exaggerated, not rushed, just factual. And I sat down at the kitchen table, the same place where so many decisions had once been made without me, and now everything returned there under my direction. She explained the inquiries, the requests for showings, the early signals from buyers who understood the value immediately, and I listened carefully, not reacting to the numbers, not letting excitement cloud clarity, because this was not about speed, it was about precision. And by midday the first serious offer came in, strong, but still within expectation, and I reviewed it without urgency, asking questions, adjusting terms, making it clear that I was not in a position of need, I was in a position of choice. And that distinction changed everything. Buyers do not just respond to price, they respond to control. And by the afternoon a second offer arrived, higher, cleaner, more direct, and my agent paused slightly before presenting it, as if she already knew what I would see, the difference not just in numbers but in intent. And I read through it slowly, noting the conditions, the timeline, the structure, and when I looked up, I did not need to ask for advice, I already knew. "We move forward with this one," I said, and she nodded once without hesitation, because certainty, when it is real, does not require discussion, it simply moves. And as the paperwork began to take shape, as signatures aligned with authority instead of assumption, I felt the final pieces fall into place, not dramatically, not loudly, but with the quiet precision of something that had been building correctly from the moment I chose to step out of their plan and into my own. Later that evening Daniel called again, but this time I did not answer immediately. I let it ring once, twice, just long enough for him to feel the distance that had formed, and when I finally picked up, his voice was no longer controlled, it was searching, trying to catch up to something he could not see clearly anymore. "Mom, what is going on?" he asked, and I could hear it now, the shift from confidence to uncertainty. And I did not explain, I did not walk him through the steps, because understanding is not something that can be handed over. It is something that arrives on its own when the reality becomes undeniable. "Everything is moving exactly as it should," I said, and for a moment there was silence, the kind that comes when someone realizes they are no longer part of the decision-making process, and I could almost hear the realization forming, not fully, not yet, but enough to unsettle whatever control they believed they still had. And when the call ended, I did not feel the need to follow up, because there was nothing left to manage on that side. Everything that mattered was already in motion, the offers, the contracts, the closing timeline, all of it moving forward under my name, my authority, my direction. And as I stood by the window that night, looking out at the same street that had not changed in decades, I realized that this was not just about selling a house, it was about reclaiming something far more important, the right to decide, the right to act, the right to exist in my own life without being quietly repositioned by someone else's plan. And now that right was no longer something I needed to defend, it was something I had already secured. The closing date was set for the following morning, quiet and efficient, just the way I wanted it, no announcements, no discussions, no room for interference, and I woke up earlier than usual that day, not because I was anxious, but because there was a clarity in knowing exactly what was about to happen. And as I moved through the house one last time before leaving, I did not linger on memories the way I thought I might. I did not stop at every doorway or run my hand along the walls as if I were saying goodbye, because this was not an ending in the way they had imagined. This was a decision, one I had made fully aware, fully in control. And when I arrived at the office, the process unfolded with a quiet precision that felt almost effortless. Documents were reviewed, signatures placed where they were meant to be, every line reflecting authority that had never left my name. And when the final paper was signed, there was no applause, no dramatic moment, just a simple confirmation that everything was complete, and with that, the house was no longer something anyone could attempt to take from me. It had already been placed exactly where I chose it to go, and the funds were transferred shortly after, the numbers clear, undeniable, higher than what had been quietly arranged without me, and I allowed myself a brief glance at the final figure, not out of surprise but out of acknowledgement, because value, when handled correctly, speaks for itself. As I stepped outside the building, my phone began to ring, Daniel's name on the screen, and I let it ring once before answering, not out of hesitation but out of intention, and when I did, his voice came through sharp, no longer measured, no longer careful. "Mom, the realtor just called me. What did you do?" he demanded, and I could hear it now, the full realization beginning to take shape, the understanding that whatever they had planned had already slipped beyond their reach. And I did not raise my voice, I did not match his urgency, I simply responded with the truth he had not expected to hear so soon. "I finalized the sale this morning," I said, and there was silence, complete, absolute, the kind that comes when there is nothing left to argue against, and then he spoke again, slower this time, almost disbelieving. "You sold it?" And I nodded, even though he could not see me. "Yes," I replied, "for more than what you had arranged." And that was when the weight of it settled, not just the loss of the house, but the loss of control, of assumption, of the belief that decisions could be made without consequence, and in the background I could hear Ashley's voice, sharp, asking questions he could not answer. And for a moment I said nothing, because the truth does not need to be repeated, it only needs to be stated once, and when I ended the call, I did not feel the need to explain further, not to them, not to anyone, because everything that needed to be understood was already clear. And as I stood there in the afternoon light, I realized that what they had tried to take quietly had been resolved just as quietly, but with one critical difference: this time the outcome belonged entirely to me. They arrived at my door that evening without calling first, which told me everything about their state of mind, because people who believe they are still in control schedule conversations, but people who have just lost it show up unannounced. And when I opened the door, Daniel stepped forward immediately, his expression tight, his movements sharp, while Ashley remained just behind him, her posture rigid, her eyes scanning past me into the house as if she were still looking for something she could claim. And I stepped aside calmly, allowing them in without a word, because there was nothing left for me to prepare. Everything that mattered had already been done, and the moment the door closed behind them, Daniel turned to me. "How could you do this without telling us?" he said, his voice controlled but strained, and I looked at him for a moment before answering, not because I needed time, but because I wanted him to hear the weight of what he had just said. "Without telling you?" I repeated quietly, and the words seemed to settle differently when reflected back. Ashley stepped in then, her tone sharper, more direct. "We had an agreement with the buyer. Contracts were in place. You cannot just override something like that," she said, and I met her gaze steadily, because this was no longer about explaining, it was about correcting. "There was no agreement that involved me," I replied, and the simplicity of that statement seemed to hit harder than anything else I could have said. Daniel ran a hand through his hair again, pacing slightly now, the composure he had tried to maintain slipping further with each passing second. "You do not understand what this means," he said, and I shook my head once, calm, certain. "I understand exactly what it means," I said. "It means you made arrangements based on something that was never yours to arrange." And for the first time Ashley's expression shifted, not just frustration but something deeper, something closer to exposure, because the structure they had built depended entirely on the assumption that I would not challenge it, and now that assumption had collapsed, there was nothing left to support their position. "We were trying to secure your future," Daniel said, but his voice lacked conviction now, the words sounding more like something he needed to believe rather than something that was true. And I did not argue with him, I simply let the silence hold for a moment before responding. "My future was never yours to secure," I said, and that was when the room changed completely, not in volume, not in movement, but in understanding, because there are moments when people realize they are no longer negotiating, they are being confronted with reality. And Ashley's voice came again, quieter this time but edged with something sharper. "Do you realize the financial loss this causes?" she asked, and I allowed myself the faintest pause before answering, not because I did not know, but because I wanted her to hear the contrast clearly. "There is no loss," I said, "only a difference between what you arranged and what I achieved." And Daniel stopped pacing then, looking at me in a way he had not before, not as someone to manage, not as someone to guide, but as someone he no longer understood, and I could see it in his eyes the moment the realization settled, that whatever control they thought they had exercised had been taken back completely, not through confrontation, not through force, but through action they had not anticipated, and as the silence returned, heavier now but clearer, I knew that nothing more needed to be said, because everything that had been hidden was now fully visible, not just to me but to them as well. Daniel did not speak again right away, and for a moment I saw something in him that I had not seen in a long time, not anger, not control, but uncertainty, the kind that comes when the story you have been telling yourself no longer holds together. And he looked down at the papers still sitting on the table, the copies I had placed there earlier, the ones that made everything undeniable, and Ashley, who had been so certain just minutes before, now stood perfectly still, her silence no longer strategic but forced, because there was nothing left she could shape into an advantage, and I moved past them slowly, not to leave the room, but to take my place in it, because for too long I had been standing at the edge of conversations that were supposed to include me, and now there was no edge, only clarity. "You should sit," I said calmly, not as an invitation but as a statement, and Daniel obeyed without thinking, lowering himself into the chair across from me, while Ashley remained standing for a second longer before doing the same, her movements controlled but no longer confident, and I folded my hands on the table, not to steady myself, but because there was no longer any reason to move. Everything I needed to say would come from stillness, not reaction. "I have already spoken with an attorney," I said, my voice even, measured, and I watched as Daniel's head lifted slightly, his attention sharpening, because legal language changes the shape of a conversation instantly. It removes emotion and replaces it with consequence. "The documents you submitted," I continued, "the authorization forms, the listing agreements, all of it has been reviewed," and Ashley's eyes flickered for just a moment, a small break in composure that confirmed what I already knew, and I did not raise my voice, I did not emphasize the words, because truth does not need emphasis, it carries its own weight. "There are irregularities," I said, and Daniel inhaled sharply, the sound quiet but unmistakable. "What does that mean?" he asked, and I met his gaze without hesitation. "It means that what you attempted to do was not just inappropriate," I said, "it was unlawful." And the word settled into the room with a finality that neither of them could ignore. Ashley's posture shifted then, subtle but telling, as if she were recalculating something in real time, looking for a way to reposition what had already been exposed. But there was no space left for that, not anymore. "I have already filed a formal notice," I added, and this time Daniel's reaction was immediate, his voice rising just slightly. "You reported us?" he said, disbelief mixing with something closer to fear, and I shook my head once, not correcting the word but clarifying the intent. "I protected myself," I said, and that was the difference they had failed to understand from the beginning, that this was never about punishing them, it was about refusing to be moved, controlled, or erased without consent, and Ashley finally spoke again, her voice lower now, controlled but strained. "This will damage everything," she said, and I looked at her calmly, because for the first time she was speaking the truth, not about me, but about the situation they had created. "It already has," I replied, and there was nothing more to add to that, no explanation, no justification, because the consequences were no longer theoretical, they were real, they were in motion, and as the silence settled once again, heavier than before but completely clear, I realized that what had begun as a quiet attempt to take something from me had ended in something far more permanent, not just the loss of the house for them, but the loss of the position they once held in my life, because some lines once crossed do not invite return, they define the end of what was once there. And in that moment, sitting across from them without anger, without hesitation, I understood that I had not just regained control of my property, I had reclaimed control of everything that came with it. Daniel did not try to argue after that, not because he agreed, but because there was nothing left to argue with, and for the first time since he had walked into that house, he looked smaller, not physically, but in the way a person looks when they realize the position they once held no longer exists, and Ashley, who had built so much of this plan on confidence and control, finally stepped back completely, her silence no longer calculated but absolute, because the truth had removed every option she thought she had, and I stood there for a moment, looking at both of them, not with anger, not even with disappointment, but with a clarity that felt almost unfamiliar, because it had taken me years to understand that love without boundaries is not kindness, it is permission, and I had given too much of that away without realizing it. "You should leave now," I said, quietly, and neither of them resisted, not this time. Daniel nodded once slowly, as if he were still trying to process how everything had shifted so completely, And Ashley did not look at me as she walked past, her focus fixed straight ahead, because there are moments when even the strongest facade cannot hold, and this was one of them. And when the door closed behind them, the silence that followed was different from any silence I had felt before. It was not empty, it was settled, like something that had finally found its place. The days that followed were not dramatic. There were no scenes, no confrontations, only consequences unfolding exactly as they were meant to. The unauthorized listing was formally removed and documented. The legal notice I had filed moved forward, and the investigation into the forged authorization did not disappear quietly the way they might have hoped, because actions, once recorded, do not simply fade, they remain. And I was informed, clearly and professionally, that the matter would be handled according to the law, not emotion, not family ties but facts, and that distinction mattered more than anything else. Daniel called once more a few days later, his voice no longer demanding, no longer defensive but uncertain, asking if there was anything he could do to fix it, and I listened without interrupting because I needed to hear that shift, not for him but for myself, to understand that the dynamic had changed completely. And when he finished, I answered simply, "There is nothing left to fix." And that was the truth, not spoken in anger but in finality, because what had been broken was not just a situation, it was trust, and trust, once redefined, does not return to what it was. Ashley never called, never reached out, and that absence said more than any explanation she could have offered, because some people do not apologize when they are exposed, they withdraw, and I accepted that without resistance, because I was no longer waiting for acknowledgement from someone who had already shown me exactly who they were. The funds from the sale were secured, properly placed, and for the first time in years every decision connected to my life was entirely my own again, not influenced, not redirected, not quietly altered behind my back, and I used that control carefully, not to prove anything, not to create distance out of spite, but to establish something that should have always been there, a boundary that could not be crossed without consequence. And as I settled into my new home, smaller but entirely mine by choice, not by pressure, I realized that what I had lost was never the house. It was the illusion that the people closest to me would always act in my best interest, and what I had gained was something far more valuable, the ability to see clearly, to act decisively, and to stand in my own life without being moved by someone else's plan. And in the end, they did not just lose the house, they lost access, they lost influence, and they lost the version of me who would have allowed it. And that is not something that can be bought back, negotiated, or repaired, because once you learn exactly where you stand, you do not step back into a place that was never truly yours to begin with.